Well, at MagicCon Vegas, Wizards of the Coast spoiled some of the cards that will be in the upcoming Hobbit set. One of them is the One Ring. Now, this won't actually be in the set. It'll be a box topper, so if you buy a box, you get one of 40 different cards. The One Ring, this version of it, is one of them. But once Wizards of the Coast announced this, Magic players immediately noticed something a little strange. They noticed that this new version of the One Ring looks oddly similar to another version of the One Ring. So let's get into what happened, why it happened, and a wrinkle here that makes the situation even more strange.
Distraction makers.
Okay, first let's go over the timeline. MagicCon Vegas, Wizards of the Coast showed some spoilers from the Hobbit set. Immediately fans started noticing that the One Ring looks oddly familiar, looks very similar to another version of the One Ring. This version of the One Ring credited to Dan Frazier. Dan Frazier has been a Magic artist for since Alpha. He is the artist that did the original Moxen. He's worked on Magic art for over 30 years and has never had any kind of plagiarism, anything happen, no kind of controversy throughout his artist career. But when we take the Marta Nael's One Ring, we flip it, and then we overlay it over the top of Dan Frazier's, we notice that these two are basically the same ring. And some people might see this and say, well, what's the big deal? It's a ring. There's only so many ways to paint it. And I think that's just sort of not understanding how diverse the ability that you have as an artist to depict things in different ways, and how subtle changes can change the mood of the piece, or even that, Dan Frazier has a very particular style, which would, in his style, the One Ring would, could be an amazing piece of art. But we'll get into why that didn't happen in a minute. So after the One Ring was spoiled, Magic players started immediately speculating, saying, hey, this looks very similar. What happened here? And this led to even the artist community around Magic the Gathering kind of being in an uproar and trying to figure out what happened. And Dan's agent, who handles, I think, his originals, his signatures, artist proofs, one of the things that he mentioned is that he had seen previous versions of the One Ring. This detail is important, and we'll come back up later. But he had seen previous versions of Dan's painting of the One Ring, and they looked nothing like this version. He said he had never seen this version before, and he also mentioned that there was a lot of revisions being requested by Wizards of the Coast or Middle-earth Entertainment, which is the IP holder of the game parts of the Lord of the Rings IP. There's also the Tolkien estate, who doesn't do the game stuff. Middle-earth Entertainment handles the game side of things. This led to another former Magic artist, Donato Giancola, basically taking this idea and running with it and making some public statements that later end up kind of having him put his foot in his mouth a little bit. But he basically is talking about how in his view, Wizards of the Coast is exploiting artists, and that Universes Beyond is particularly bad in terms of artist contracts. Donato has also alleged that Wizards of the Coast has used his artwork in some of their concept art or style guides without consulting him, and asked other artists to paint in his style without actually hiring him. And that has led Donato to ceasing to work with Wizards of the Coast, I think around 2 years ago, he mentioned. This is also in addition to the Faye Dalton situation with Trouble in Pairs, where Donato's work was the images that were clipped from for the image on Trouble in Pairs, and effectively used without his permission. In a similar situation, what happened here with Dan Frazier's The One Ring. So immediately this sort of starts spiraling rumors about how Wizards of the Coast was the entity to blame here, essentially saying that they photoshopped this One Ring over the top of whatever art Dan had made, and then left Dan Frazier's name as the artist credit. And then the next day, we get a joint statement from Dan and Wizards of the Coast about what happened. The message says, recently fans noted the similarities between the One Ring by Marta Nael and the newly released image of the One Ring by Dan Frazier. These similarities are not coincidental, unfortunately. This part's from Dan. He says, I made a mistake and I feel awful. I especially feel for Marta, whose work I adore. In trying to create an iconic version of the One Ring while looking at reference online, I ended up using Marta's ring as a reference and painted over it to try to depict the item fans hold dear to their hearts. In doing so, I didn't make it my own. I'm reaching out to Marta privately to apologize artist to artist. I love creating art for Magic. I've loved being a part of this artist community for more than 30 years, and I'm sorry I've let my fans down. Sincerely, Dan Frazier. Wizards of the Coast then makes the statement, Dan Frazier is a titan of the art industry and of Magic the Gathering. He has created so many pieces of art for the game that he will forever be a part of our game. and we value his contributions tremendously. With that in mind, we're disappointed our review process didn't catch the issue. Like Dan, we have already reached out to apologize to Marta Nael for not catching the use of her art in this piece. None of this was intentional, but we're going to make it right as much as we can. On digital versions of the card, we will credit both Dan Frazier and Marta Nael. We will also make sure Marta is compensated for her work here. This is a good moment to recognize that we are all humans who make mistakes. Dan made a mistake. We made mistakes in our process to not catch the error. We don't condone or accept either, but we still value Dan and his contributions and are grateful for his place in the game. Thank you to the eagle-eyed fans who noticed this. For all of you for being strong advocates for amazing art and artists. Sincerely, all of us at Wizards of the Coast. This kind of raises a few more questions, unfortunately. One of which is, this image from Dan Frazier doesn't really look anything like any of his other work. And part of that, well, is because he copied Marta Nael's ring. But there's another factor at play here, which is that when artists are working on Universes Beyond properties, most of them, they're required to paint digitally because they're not allowed to sell original art as part of their contracts when they work on a Universes Beyond piece. Let me go over a little bit of what the deal is here in terms of like how artists make their money on Magic cards, and part of the reason why Magic art is some of the best in the industry. So Wizards of the Coast pay rates in terms of illustration industry as a whole are pretty bad. They pay somewhere between $1,250. Last I knew, it might be a bit more than maybe $1,500 now. If you're working on something like a Planeswalker, it could be around $2,500. These rates, when you compare them to a company like Riot Games or something, Riot Games pays somewhere around $6,000 per illustration. So Magic's rates are particularly bad in terms of the industry as a whole when we look at things like video games or book covers or the other avenues for artists to the other jobs artists might be able to take on. So then the question is, why does Magic get to have access to the caliber of artists that would be working on things like book covers for much more money? We talked about this a little bit in our interview with Victor Adame Minguez. But basically, if you are a painter who paints in oils, you will have an original painting after you have made the art for the Magic card. And that original painting might sell for somewhere between $3,000, $10,000, $25,000. Like really the sky's the limit depending on the card. On top of this, Wizards of the Coast also sends artists what are called artist proofs. These are Magic cards on the front and they're white on the back. And artists use these as a canvas. They'll paint or draw additional images on these and then they'll sell them as basically a pseudo original piece of artwork. Artists can also do signatures. They can sell prints and playmats. Playmats specifically have to go through Ultra Pro. That's part of just the contractual obligations when you sign up to do a Magic card. When we get to the Universes Beyond contracts, though, all that stuff is eliminated. So the total value of a piece of Magic art that you might do, you might be paid $1,500, let's say, to do that piece of art. But then you can sell all of these additional things to sort of make up for what you might have gotten paid if you had worked for a different client. There's somewhere around the neighborhood of about $6,000 that is being sort of removed from artists when they do a piece for Universes Beyond. And it's because none of that secondary market stuff is available for them to sell. It's basically entirely up to the entity that owns the intellectual property, and that's why Marvel is okay. Marvel is fine because Marvel's used to doing this kind of thing with their artists for comic book covers, that kind of thing. And so Marvel has said it's A-okay for Magic artists to sell their original paintings of the illustrations they're doing for Magic cards of Marvel characters. But that is a very unique case amongst Universes Beyond in its entirety. Back to the One Ring issue at hand. Let's talk about a few different scenarios that could have caused this kind of an outcome. And the first one is just that Dan ripped off the art. It's totally possible that for whatever reason, at the end of his, or nearing the end of his 30-plus year career with Magic the Gathering, he decided to commit blatant copyright infringement, commit blatant plagiarism, and copy-paste Marta Nael's One Ring onto his art for whatever reason. I've seen some speculation, which I think is pretty gross, to speculate that he is in mental decline because he's relatively old. But like, if you don't know him personally, it's pretty weird to say that. People who are 80 years old can be totally with it. So yeah, I mean, scenario one, we basically just take this at face value. Dan Frazier copy pasted the One Ring, intended to paint over it, didn't pull it off, and then Wizards of the Coast just didn't catch it in their quality assurance processes to get the card out the door. And in this case, I think, both entities are somewhat to blame in that, Wizards of the Coast didn't catch it, and part of their process of pumping out sets as quickly as they are is probably putting a lot of stress on the people that would catch that kind of thing, the art directors in particular. We do know in this situation that there was other versions of the One Ring here that Wizards of the Coast or Middle Earth Entertainment was asking for revisions on. This was said by Dan's agent, who had seen previous versions of the One Ring. So the other factor here, the other sort of scenario, is that Dan was forced to work in a medium that he doesn't work in. Dan works in a traditional media and he paints on marbled paper. So the paper that you see in his images, that sort of swirly backgrounds and things, that's iconic to his look. And he paints. I don't know if he's done any other digital work at all. Maybe he has, but it definitely seems like that's not his typical process. And it's not that like artists can't move between digital and traditional. A lot of those skills transfer over, but quite a few of them don't. If you've spent your entire career developing techniques with traditional media, it might be quite difficult for you to replicate those things digitally. Wizards of the Coast does pay artists a bit more for universes beyond art because they know that there's no access to the secondary market. So they pay about double what the normal rates are, so about $12.50 in addition to the regular payments that they would pay artists. But that doesn't really make up for the fact that like the average amount that you would make from all these secondary market sales is closer to $6,000. So there's a third scenario here. This is not the first time that this has happened with Wizards of the Coast. Another beloved fantasy artist has been in a similar scenario where his work was used by another artist in a book cover. That artist I'm talking about is Todd Lockwood. He's the one that did the art and concept work on the dragons for 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, which basically defined the look of modern dragons in D&D. I'm assuming most of you have seen these images before, but the one in particular that we want to look at is the Silver Dragon. And as we can see, this is Todd Lockwood's Silver Dragon. And according to Todd Lockwood, so this is a bit alleged, I'm not sure how this all panned out, but according to Todd Lockwood, Wizards of the Coast forced another artist to use this as like copy pasted into their book cover for Dragonlance. So here's Todd's original Silver Dragon, and then here is the book cover. And if we, again, flip the dragon around and overlay it over the top on the book cover here, we can see that this is effectively the same pose, similar specular highlights, same design. Now, the design makes sense because this is Wizards of the Coast designed. This is what a silver dragon looks like in D&D. But the pose in particular, right, this depiction of this silver dragon is Todd Lockwood's. This is plagiarism, and maybe it's not ethically, there's sort of some ethical problems involved with this, but there is no real legal issues. And the reason why is because when artists do work for Magic the Gathering, they are under what's called a work for hire contract. A work for hire contract means that basically getting paid for your services in making that piece of art, and then the company that you worked for now owns all of the copyrights to that image. This is pretty industry standard, so this isn't really this isn't just a Wizards of the Coast problem, but basically what it means is that when we look at this in conjunction to other artistic mediums, artists will not be paid royalties if their images are reused. And that also means that Wizards of the Coast can just decide, I'm going to cut this image up, I'm going to have it pasted into this other image, and there's no, artists don't get anything for that. So I will commend Wizards of the Coast in this situation because they did decide to pay Marta Nael. They've stated that they will compensate her for this error. But I do wonder if nobody had pointed this out, nobody had noticed, then nothing would have happened, right? It just would have gone to print. It would have been out in circulation, and maybe eventually somebody notices something. But the immediate backlash, I think, spurred Wizards of the Coast into action here, where they don't really, there's no legal recourse, right? Marta Nael can't sue Wizards of the Coast or Dan Frazier for this plagiarism, because Wizards of the Coast are the ones that own the image, so they can do whatever they want with it. Similar to the situation with the Silver Dragon, we don't know if that's exactly what happened here. It could be that Dan Frazier is the one who has said in his statement, he copy-pasted this, he painted over it. Wizards of the Coast did not force him to do this. What this highlights for me is just the sorry state of creating fantasy art for these giant corporations, right? It is a frustrating experience where there are a lot of artists that want to do this kind of work. And so all of the artists in that situation are put into a position where their labor can be exploited. And, Wizards of the Coast is choosing to pay lower rates. They could pay more. They're making billions of dollars. They have not raised the rates for artists in a very long time. Artists used to make $1,000 per illustration way back, in the year like 2000. Now they make about $1,200 to $1,500, something like that. And like adjusted for inflation, they're actually paying less than what they used to. With them making billions of dollars and choosing not to pay their artists more, like it's pretty bad. It's not great. But also on the artist side of things, artists are choosing to do the work, right? And part of that is access to those secondary market sales. As far as myself goes, the reason I am an artist, the reason I am a game designer is because of Wizards of the Coast. It's because of Magic the Gathering. It's because of D&D and these worlds inspiring me to look and move in that direction and try to aspire to have my artwork in these books at one point in time. I don't really care for that anymore, and that's partially because of this situation. I don't do any work for hire work with my art, and it's because I want to own my own images. I want to own the copyrights to my stuff, and that's partially inspired by artists like Frank Frazetta, who in his time was an advocate for artist rights and for owning your originals, owning the copyrights to your work. For him, something like the Death Dealer painting, and his family still licenses that image out to different companies, and they can receive royalties for Frank Frazetta's legacy. The fact that most of these companies are scooping up all of these copyrights, what incentive do they have when all of the companies are working this way? But I think in an ideal world, you would have artists be commissioned for their work and then paid royalties when the cards are reprinted with that art on them. And currently that doesn't happen. Artists do receive artist proofs when a card is reprinted. They also get sent a booster box of the product that it's in. But that's not anything like what, say, something like the music industry gets, where we even see now copyright strikes on YouTube and things for using music that you didn't pay for. This whole situation sucks. It's very sad. It sucks to see that this will be part of Dan Frazier's legacy. They put out that statement, and so we can take that statement at its word that this is effectively what happened. It is strange that there were other versions of the One Ring out there somewhere. Maybe we'll see them one day. Having an artist be put into a situation where they're working in a way that they don't normally work, and they're potentially under tight deadline, who knows, right? I am particularly empathetic to the artists in these situations, so it might just be that I don't want to think that Dan Frazier would have done this, considering his legacy, right? His storied history as a fantasy artist. And I think we need to come back to Marta Nael for a minute here, because she's really the one, who is kind of the victim of the situation, right? Her art was stolen and plagiarized and morphed and put onto another One Ring. Wizards of the Coast has decided to compensate her for this. We don't know what that amount is going to be, but I'm going to link her website in the description. So if you are so inclined, head on over to her website, purchase artist proofs or signatures or prints from her to support her through this kind of situation and show that we appreciate her efforts as being part of the Magic the Gathering artist community. So yeah, at the end here, I don't know. This situation sucks. Dan made a mistake. Wizards of the Coast made a mistake. We can follow the statement here and just take that at face value. But I think this is a pretty good opportunity to talk about the situation that Magic artists are being put into because of these contracts, because of the way that the industry works right now. And so I think more than ever, now is the time to support independent artists. If there's Magic artists that you love that have independent projects, support those. It really does suck to see so many of the artists I admire so greatly deciding not to work with Wizards of the Coast anymore. Todd Lockwood, Donato Giancola, who knows what's going on with Dan Frazier at this point. But yeah, it feels like, in a lot of these instances, the artists don't want to work with Wizards anymore because of the pay or because of the way that their art is being used and depicted. And I can't really blame them, right? They are giving up their copyrights to the work because they love fantasy and because of the potential for secondary market sales. And without those incentives, I think it might be tough for Magic the Gathering to continue having the best artists in the world work on their games. They're eroding the reason why artists spend so much time on these Magic paintings. And without that incentive, I worry that we're going to have artists that don't feel like they should do that, and they don't have the financial incentive to do so. And because of that, they're sort of eroding, the legacy of Magic. They're eroding player trust, quality of Magic the Gathering. And I think that, once you're sort of going down that path of extraction, right, there's so much goodwill built up over years and years from Magic the Gathering, from Wizards of the Coast, generally speaking, with D&D and Magic. If you start moving too much into that extraction mode, which, we've kind of seen a lot of these things happening, that's hard to get back. Like once that trust is gone, and those diehard players that have been around through thick and thin with the games, once they start to move on, I think that puts Wizards in a particularly precarious situation. Right now, Universe Beyond, it's killing it, right? Bringing tons of new players. I think time will tell as to whether or not those players will stick around for the long haul, and I think a lot of that depends on the quality of the game. Yeah, I guess that's about all I have for this conversation. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to continue the conversation. If you have a game you're working on, you can join our Discord. It's a collective of independent creators where we're all working on our own art and games and things. So link is in the description. Also, make sure you check out Marta Nael's website if you are interested in any artist proofs, prints, playmats, that sort of thing. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.